Opening up diagonals for your queen and bishop instantly injects life into the game. Instantly contesting the center, this Sicilian defense creates asymmetric pawn structures that often lead to sharp, dynamic play. Accelerating development, this knight prepares to contest central squares and black's king's flank. Embracing a solid pawn structure, black aims for a more closed game, potentially preparing for d5. Unleashing central pressure, challenging black's pawn structure and dictating the game's dynamic flow. Opening the center with that capture immediately invites pawn tension and an active piece development race for black. Capturing the pawn establishes central influence and clears a path for further piece development, setting up a potentially dynamic game. Planning for queenside expansion and controlling b5, this maneuver subtly curbs white's knight potential. Developing knight, this move secures the center and prepares queenside expansion, subtly increasing pressure on black's pawn structure. Aims to prepare development and challenge the center. Developing the bishop to d3 immediately solidifies white's central presence and prepares for kingside castling, while eyeing the d4 square for potential pawn pushes. Developing the knight here to c6, a classic Sicilian structure, perfectly prepares to contest the center and eyes the d4 square, creating immediate central tension and potential pressure on white's knight. Developing the bishop to this square aims to fortify the pawn chain while preparing to castle kingside, a logical step to secure the monarch and connect the rooks, potentially eyeing the kingside for future pawn thrusts or piece activity. Developing the knight to f6, this natural repositioning opens lines for the king's bishop and prepares for castling, simultaneously challenging white's central pawn structure and eyeing the d4 knight's potential retreat. A crucial step in securing the king's safety is now complete, allowing white to develop more freely and prepare for potential middle-game skirmishes with a defended monarch. Exchanging those knights immediately surrenders central influence for black, creating a more passive pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's bishop pair. Doubling the bishop on the d-file instantly claims central influence and prepares to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Challenging the central pawn chain and immediately disrupting white's bishop pair control, this bishop maneuver forces a decision, potentially opening lines for black's pieces while exposing white's king to a more active endgame if exchanges occur. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn effectively opens lines and forces black's queen into a more exposed position, while also clearing a path for white's rooks to become active and potentially target the king. Reclaiming the central square and re-establishing a connected pawn structure, black's queen now eyes the kingside while defending d5. White's bishop pair is gone, simplifying white's attacking potential and potentially paving the way for a more even middle-game fight where each side can develop their pieces harmoniously. Venturing the knight to the rim, white seeks to disrupt black's piece harmony and exploit the queenside weaknesses, aiming to create imbalances while black's king remains somewhat exposed. Relocating the queen to the queenside initiates a repositioning battle, aiming to exploit the open queenside files and potentially challenge white's control of the c-file, though it also vacates the d5 square, a previously contested central outpost. Asserting control over the central squares and preparing to expand on the queenside, this move aims to restrict black's development and potentially trap the vulnerable queen. Striking at the queenside, this advance aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain vital space, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This pawn capture unwraps a vital queenside pawn majority for white, promising significant endgame potential once those pawns start marching. The immediate consequence is the removal of a key defender from black's castled position, subtly increasing pressure on the kingside down the road. Observe how the queenside pawn structure now becomes a more prominent battleground, potentially leading to pawn races where white holds a material advantage in pawns. It's a move that prioritizes long-term positional gain over immediate tactical fireworks, aiming to slowly suffocate black's space. Opening the queenside file with the pawn capture immediately creates dynamic imbalances and future tactical opportunities. Re-establishing piece activity on the queenside is the primary aim here, as the knight seeks a more dynamic square after its previous excursion to a4 proved somewhat passive, while also preparing to potentially contest the central d4 square again should the opportunity arise. Pushing the b-pawn here creates an immediate spatial imbalance, forcing white's knight to retreat and potentially disrupting white's coordination. But it also opens up the c-file for black's rook later and sacrifices pawn structure over there. Venture into the enemy camp. This knight's journey to b5 creates a fork, threatening both the rook on a8 and the pawn on c7, demanding immediate attention and forcing black into a defensive posture. Castling swiftly secures the monarch, a prudent decision amidst the expanding central pawn chains and potential for white's knight to infiltrate further. The immediate safety of the king is paramount before contemplating any offensive maneuvers, especially given the open nature of the position and the active piece play. Unleashing a pawn thrust, white immediately creates a wedge, driving into black's queenside structure and forcing a decision from the knight on f6. This aggressive pawn advance aims to disrupt black's coordination, potentially trapping pieces or opening lines for an assault on the king. It's a calculated risk, as it advances a pawn deep into enemy territory, but it also creates immediate tension and demands a precise response from black to avoid falling into a disadvantageous position. A daring foray by the knight, venturing deep into enemy territory to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially unleash an attack on the queenside. Activating the queenside pawns now aims to disrupt black's coordination and seize attacking chances along the newly opened lines, potentially forcing weaknesses. Suddenly, the queenside pawns face a significant threat, with your bishop now poised to disrupt white's advancing structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. Aimed squarely at the uncastled king, this queen sortie dramatically escalates the kingside pressure, threatening immediate checkmate patterns if black isn't acutely careful with their defense. Opening the kingside with this pawn thrust suddenly exposes the monarch, creating a delicate balance of power where the queen's aggressive posturing might become a double-edged sword. Shifting the queen to the side opens up diagonal pathways, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the kingside that black's last move might have created by loosening the kingside pawn structure and bringing the knight out. Black immediately confronts the central pawn thrust, seeking to break down white's space advantage and create dynamic counterplay along the now open b-file. The aggressive pawn push disrupts white's knight's ideal outpost on b5 and opens a pathway for the queen to potentially influence the queenside. This move injects significant tactical uncertainty, forcing white to carefully calculate whether they can maintain their initiative or if they'll be drawn into a less favorable exchange. Reclaiming the central file and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or simply consolidating queenside pressure presents a multifaceted challenge for black. This maneuver is about more than just occupation. It's about signaling intentions and offering white difficult choices. The bishop's retreat to c6 initiates a fascinating interplay of defensive resources and potential counterplay, subtly reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for further maneuvering, though it cedes some central influence and creates a slight structural weakness on d6 should white press the attack. Unleashing the queen to raid the queenside, this maneuver forces a decision from black regarding their vulnerable pawn chain and aims to exploit the exposed dark squares around the black king. The knight, having retreated to its home square, now seeks greener pastures on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for its own pieces. This maneuver introduces fascinating tactical possibilities, as the knight's presence on b6 could threaten immediate pawn breaks or create future weaknesses for the opponent. It's a subtle yet potent way to reposition for the ensuing battle, preparing to contest key squares and exploit any overextension by white's pieces. Seizing the open b-file with this exchange now creates a lasting imbalance, as white's queen becomes a highly active piece, targeting black's queenside pawns while simultaneously defending against potential breakthroughs. The queenside initiative truly explodes as black daringly plucks through a pawn, introducing immediate complications and a fascinating strategic gamble. However, this seemingly greedy grab comes with significant positional concessions, potentially exposing black's king to white's central pawn push and a coordinated attack, creating a knife-edge situation where precise defense will be paramount. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop to pressure that weak pawn structure around black's king is a key idea here. A bold foray into the enemy's territory, this knight's excursion seeks to disrupt white's central control and exploit the open lines. By appearing on c5, it immediately pressures the d3 bishop and aims to create complications, potentially forcing white to make concessions to maintain their structural integrity. The knight is now a powerful outpost, ready to participate in any tactical skirmishes that may arise, even if it momentarily disconnects it from its own pawn structure. The raid on the queen side is complete, snagging a pawn and establishing an imposing knight outpost. This capture transforms the strategic landscape, initiating a decisive material advantage for white that black will struggle to compensate for in the ensuing exchanges. A surprising concession of material, this captures a piece but opens a dangerous diagonal for white's remaining bishop and allows a swift advance on the queen side, potentially trapping black's rook. Suddenly, an exchange on the rook file significantly alters the material balance and opens up new avenues for attack, despite the seemingly equalized pawn structure on the queen side. The rook's repositioning offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to contest the now open a file and potentially create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. Unleashing the knight to this central outpost immediately targets the undefended pawn on b3 and eyes the weak squares around black's king, creating a formidable attacking spearhead. Unleashing a tactical counteroffensive, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside control by activating the bishop along the open diagonal. White regains the sacrificed material, simplifying into a pawn-up endgame where black's isolated queenside pawns are a significant weakness. Recovering the piece is paramount, and this capture not only rebalances material but also clears a vital diagonal for black's bishop, potentially activating it for future defensive duties or even a surprising counterattack. The rook's journey to the heart of black's position initiates a crucial endgame battle, aiming to exploit the exposed king and the vulnerable backward pawn on a3, potentially unraveling black's defense through pressure on the open c-file and the coordination of white's remaining pieces. Creating a wall of pawns around the monarch feels like a desperate attempt to shield him, but this aggressive advance on the king side opens up avenues for white's remaining pieces to exploit the weakened structure. Finally, the queen's hunt leads to this forcing check, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety and seize control of the open files. The black king is now exposed to a relentless barrage down the open c-file, a consequence of abandoning defensive coordination for the sake of material acquisition earlier in the game. The rook's maneuver finally secures an advantage, forcing black into a passive position with a severely weakened king. Stepping onto f8 is a pragmatic retreat, acknowledging the recent exchange that has simplified the position but left the king exposed on a half-open file. Its priority now shifts to consolidating the remaining pieces and seeking a safer haven, perhaps behind the d-pawn, before white can further exploit the open lines and centralize their knight. The knight's repositions to d6, eyeing the advanced pawn on g5 and reinforcing the passed pawn on f5, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential kingside pawn push. Pushing the g-pawn now offers a desperate attempt to create some attacking potential, but it's more of a distraction than a genuine threat, as the pawns on the queen side are also quite vulnerable to further pressure. The king is being actively brought into the fray, aiming to support the kingside pawns and potentially participate in the coming exchanges. Activating the king on e7, the black monarch ventures into the open, aiming to participate in the unfolding middle game skirmish and potentially join the fight on the king side, though this bold maneuver opens up avenues for white's pieces to exploit any hesitation. Focusing the king towards the king side opens up avenues for potential pawn breaks and future pawn pushes, aiming to create dynamic play and possibly a passed pawn on the king side, while simultaneously preparing to consolidate the position by bringing more pieces into the fray to support the king and centralize activity. Relocating the king to the center of the board now looks like a proactive stance, aiming to activate it before the pawn structure solidifies further and potentially traps it. Pushing the pawn forward now, h4, seems to aim at bolstering the king's defensive structure, a proactive step to create a more solid barrier against any potential threats that might materialize from the opposing forces, especially considering the king's somewhat exposed position in the center. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black aims to disrupt white's king's safety. This aggressive pawn push, while creating a passed pawn on the h-file, simultaneously weakens the dark squares around black's monarch, potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. The endgame is rapidly approaching, and white will need to be vigilant in navigating the resulting pawn structure and king activity. The kingside pawn structure is irrevocably shattered, opening lines and creating potential weaknesses for black's monarch, while simultaneously liberating white's own king to potentially participate more actively in the ensuing exchanges. The king embarks on a perilous journey to the center, potentially opening avenues for counterplay, but also exposing itself to further checks down the open files. The monarch ventures out from its safe haven, aiming to participate in the final skirmish, a bold gambit that could either galvanize the remaining forces or expose it to unforeseen dangers on the open terrain. The king makes a vital journey towards the center, seeking refuge and potential activity as the pawn structure thins. Unlocking the king's potential offers a surprising avenue for the white army, creating dynamic counterplay despite the material deficit. The king's bold foray to the center, though seemingly active, exposes it to potential discovered attacks and checks as white's knight repositions for better control. The kingside pawn push finally opens a path for the white king's centralization, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame rather than a passive observer. Initiating a daring pawn push toward the king is an adventurous attempt to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines, though it risks further weakening black's own king's safety by creating additional pawn weaknesses. Pushing the h-pawn creates a passed pawn, a vital asset in any endgame, and forces the black king to commit further, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. The bishop's sudden redeployment to d1 aims to offer the last rank defense, a subtle but potentially critical maneuver as the kings inch closer to opposing pawn structures. Clearing a path for the king is paramount, but this pawn push risks isolating it further. The bishop's retreat to h5 finally creates some breathing room, aiming to reconnect with the king's defense and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure now, this advance seeks to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create a passed pawn of its own, while also improving white's piece mobility.